Hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Syed Kamall. I'm the Acting Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm also a Professor of Politics and International Relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham. Now today we'll be discussing the Northern Ireland Protocol with journalist Owen Polley and the IEA's Head of Regulatory Affairs, Victoria Hewson. Owen and Victoria, thank you both for joining us today. Within a year of the 2016 referendum, there were already concerns growing that Northern Ireland could be used as a bargaining chip in negotiations, and some feared that the border might derail the Brexit process altogether. Now, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was designed to keep trade flowing and to avoid checkpoints, was agreed by Boris Johnson as he focused on getting a Brexit deal in time for the 2019 general election. An FTA was signed between the UK and the EU on the 31st December 2020, but since then the UK government and the EU, as well as Northern Irish parties, have traded blows over its implementation. Businesses have warned of an unworkable situation when various grace periods come to an end this year, and citizens complain it is interfering too much in their everyday lives. So let's turn to both of you. Before we get into the details of this discussion, Victoria, could you explain for someone who doesn't really understand what it is, what the Northern Ireland Protocol is and why it's so important for the UK-EU trade agreement? And then perhaps give your own assessment, whether it was an acceptable solution to the border question. And then I'll ask Owen what he thinks of it as a solution as well.
Yes, thanks, Syed. Well, I think, as you mentioned, this really does go right back to the immediate aftermath of the referendum and the discussion right at the outset of the Article 50 process about the so-called sequencing of negotiations. And the EU made a very shrewd tactical maneuver, if you like, to be cynical about it, by saying that some form of resolution or insurance policy to protect the open land border between Northern Ireland and Ireland would be a prerequisite before they would move forward on any other matters of negotiating our exit and future trade agreement. And then people might remember way back in December 2017, there was something called a joint report that was signed by Theresa May, sort of agreeing on this sequencing issue, where they agreed that in order to preserve the open border and avoid a hard border and protect the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, that either the UK would agree to alignment with the EU Single Market and Customs Union, or potentially we might find some other solutions by agreement. Now, obviously, the EU had no incentive whatsoever to find any other solutions because they could rest on this assurance that the UK would agree to essentially to full alignment. And so then the negotiations rolled on, and what May eventually agreed to was a sort of UK-wide backstop. Although I must say, without getting too much into the weeds, there's been a certain amount of revisionism of what the May deal consisted of, because the May deal would also actually have meant checks and controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because it was two separate customs union and Northern Ireland in the single market and Great Britain not. However, I digress slightly. May obviously couldn't manage to get her deal through, but had had her legs chopped off very, very badly by some pretty poor negotiations and refusal to accept the possibility of no deal. And then ultimately, Boris Johnson's government kind of also accepted that Northern Ireland would have some kind of different and special treatment. And so they agreed this form of the Northern Ireland Protocol in order to get Brexit done, basically. And that, it's important to remember, is actually in the withdrawal agreement. It's a protocol to the withdrawal agreement from 2019, rather than part of the free trade agreement that was just signed last Christmas. However, the ongoing free trade agreement is premised on the basis of both sides actually implementing and respecting the protocol. So what's in the protocol? Well, technically speaking, and perhaps only in nominal terms, under the protocol, Northern Ireland is in the UK customs territory, but actually has to implement all EU border checks and formalities. And so fiscally, it's in the UK customs territory in terms of the underlying duties that are payable on imports, but it has to apply the EU customs code. And it's also, and this potentially is where the most difficulties are going to come from, and have already been coming from, is that in regulatory terms, they have to continue to apply the full EU single market regulation rulebook on goods and indeed on state aid. Now, this basically means it's a completely separate territory from Great Britain for the purposes of importing goods from Great Britain. So importers into Northern Ireland have to submit customs declarations, and they have to comply with all the certification requirements that any third country importer into the EU would comply with. So what we had agreed with the EU coming into the start of this year, when the protocol came into effect, was these so-called grace periods, where some of the regulations, in particular on the importation of food from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which is extremely vital because Northern Ireland's supermarkets and all consumer supply chains are very much integrated into the United Kingdom single market. So the grace periods made it a little bit easier for that, a little bit easier for parcels. So when you order things from eBay or off Amazon, there was some facilitations put in place for that. And there was also a 12-month, thankfully, grace period agreed for medicines. Now that battle is still to come, as in when we come up to the end of that grace period at the end of the year. The other critical point to notice, and the possibly real pivotal difference between what May had agreed and what Boris Johnson was able to get through, is the consent mechanism, whereby in 4 years' time, the Northern Ireland Assembly gets to vote on whether or not to continue with this arrangement. And I'm sure Owen will be able to reflect a bit on how that's likely to play out in the vibrant politics of Northern Ireland.
Let's turn to that. Why don't we turn to that now, Owen? Clearly there is not one Northern Irish perspective, but you obviously cover Northern Ireland. How is the protocol seen by the Northern Irish? Maybe you can talk about the differences between the communities. And were there alternatives that were probably obvious to you that the UK government and the EU should have considered?
Well, one of the striking things about the way that the protocol has been, about the reaction to the protocol really, is just how immediately the wheels have come off, even at a time when there's relatively little kind of economic activity in terms of shops and things like that. The consequences of the protocol have been very clear. Something like over 50% of businesses, manufacturing businesses, saying that their supply chains have been affected badly. All kinds of other kind of subsidiary issues arising like that. And obviously that there's a political divide as to how people see it, because unionists very much want to get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. They very much see it as something that's been inflicted on them without their consent. And nationalists, while they can see the practical issues, I think they also see it as a way of drawing them closer to the Republic of Ireland, politically speaking. So whether there was an alternative to it very much depends on your political standpoint. But Victoria sort of touched upon the idea earlier that that Brexit made this inevitable, that the protocol was an outworking of Brexit. But I mean, if you go back to the very early days after the referendum result, when British officials were putting out feelers to Enda Kenny and his government, he was the Irish Taoiseach at that time, there was very much a sense that some kind of arrangement with backroom tech and goodwill could get over this, and that a kind of a seamless border could be the outcome. The difficulty, of course, was that Theresa May and the government were very adamant that there could not be any border on the Irish frontier between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and really that kind of that pledge was taken almost as a hostage to fortune, and they've been trying to come up with a solution ever since. That was an unwise thing to say. I mean, that the idea should have been that we wanted to keep the border as seamless as possible, but that a slight hardening of the border, some infrastructure, some cameras, things like that, were always a possibility.
Now, you said about Enda Kenny at the beginning, and also the whole idea about looking at technology. If I remember correctly, when Varadkar became the Prime Minister, he ended that cooperation initially, and he started to play politics. He started to play the good European. Barnier would hold him up as a good European, and he started to almost, rather than be the honest broker, which would have been a very statesmanlike role, he decided to play the EU cards. Is that seen very much in Northern Ireland as well? That that Varadkar put politics above sort of practical consideration and playing the statesman?
Yes, absolutely, and it's been puzzling to watch, really, because although that plays well among voters, and it plays to a kind of a Republican nationalist instinct, it wasn't in the Republic of Ireland's economic interests, because actually, if you pay close attention to the Southern Irish press and everything else, they're beginning to experience the same problems that Northern Ireland is experiencing with friction between GB and the ROI, because they're very dependent upon imports from Britain as well. So, this was a self-defeating act, really, by the Republic of Ireland, but they decided at a very early stage that they were going to place themselves very much in the EU camp, and not as a sort of honest broker trying to get an arrangement that would work for both sides of the fence.
And Victoria, let me ask you: were there alternatives to the protocol from your perspective? You clearly have a very good technical understanding of these issues. Could you see alternatives?
Well, there were a number of alternatives, and really all of them, certainly from a UK unionist perspective, involved a fundamental acknowledgement that there actually is already a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The Belfast Agreement did not get rid of the border; it got rid of military installations at the border, and put in place certain cross-border cooperation mechanisms. And actually, and I wrote at the time that it's those mechanisms that should have been used to build a solution, both acting north-south through those institutions under the Belfast Agreement, and also the greatly neglected, almost forgotten about third strand of the Belfast Agreement being the East-West London-Dublin cooperation forums should have been used. The big problem, though, was that for as long as the EU insisted that there would be no derogations or extra facilitations made available, then there was always going to be a need for physical infrastructure at the border, because that's an EU rule, is that, for example, animal-based food products, and indeed live animals or animal exports, have to be reported to a border inspection post. So there you have already an absolute black and white EU legal requirement for a physical piece of infrastructure at the border. And the EU, using the leverage that they had, just said, well, we're not going to change that law. That law's there for a reason. We have to protect the single market, and we're not going to change it. And similarly, and I think actually much more of a problem that, people like me who were involved in trying to come up with alternative arrangements, a bigger problem is just every single consignment that is imported into the EU customs union has to be declared. You have to make a customs declaration. And that goes from the smallest package to the biggest consignment of steel or whatever it is. They have to have a customs declaration. And for small traders operating either side of the border, we could frame ways of doing it. We could frame the best high-tech ways of doing it. That would really be possible to do without physical infrastructure, because vast majority of goods aren't checked. But unless the EU was going to agree to a substantial derogation, that would mean that small local businesses crossing the border multiple times wouldn't have to fill in a customs declaration every time they drop off a consignment at the cash and carry or pick up a consignment from their local cash and carry. then we were in some difficulties. But ultimately, that's what a border means, and there are already lots of border formalities for things like excise duty. For, arguably Britain and Ireland should have been doing a lot more to protect their existing domestic markets from cross-border smuggling of things like cigarettes and fuel and other excise duties.
Let me interrupt you there, because quite often at some borders, an awful lot of stuff that flows across the borders is not actually checked at borders.
Correct.
Sometimes they're checked elsewhere. They're checked in bonded warehouses. They're checked, on trusted traders, schemes, whatever. Why haven't we seen more of that for the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Well, I think this is the issue, is that some people are actually arguing that the EU is enforcing its border rules even more strongly on Northern Ireland ports than it's doing on any other ports. There was an astonishing figure that was quoted, I think, in the Northern Ireland Assembly last week, that as it stands at present, there are more border checks being done at the ports of Northern Ireland than in the rest of the EU put together. Because, and that's partly because of the patterns of trade, but they're essentially putting full external trade checks and controls on a domestic trade route. Yeah. So that's it inevitably is a very poor fit, and this is why we're seeing all these disruptions, and it's why ultimately the UK government got on the front foot last week and said we are going to extend these grace periods, because otherwise these consequences are going to be really terrible for consumers in Northern Ireland.
I saw Owen nodding there. Do you see it the same way, that actually there could have been more checks away from the border, that Northern Ireland, this particular border, has been picked on, or I mean that's too strong a word, being focused on by the EU? Is that very much in Northern Ireland?
I think that it actually reveals that the Northern Ireland Protocol was partly designed to be almost a punitive measure to punish Britain for having the temerity to leave the European Union. The statistic that Victoria was alluding to, I think it was actually 20% of checks for the whole European Union this year have taken place between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And I believe that it's normal to check maybe about 1% of goods coming in from outside the European Union, whereas 20% of the checks have been taking place. So it's not only been disruptive, but it's been the onerous nature of these checks. And I mean, I believe as well, the people that I speak to, the amount of bureaucracy and form filling in that they're having to do is really in excess of anything that they were led to expect. And the government has brought in something like the Trader Support Service, which was supposed to make things easy. But really, they're being asked to fill in the same amount of information, just into a different portal. So I'm told that these supplementary declarations are really as bad as a full customs declaration. So the way that this has been implemented, even above and beyond the fact that it was already an extraordinary arrangement and an arrangement that was going to hurt the Northern Ireland economy, is hurting the Northern Ireland economy even more. And it has been used almost as a kind of a punitive measure to show that Brexit has to hurt.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that the EU made quite clear. They want to show other countries that it's not easy to leave the EU. A number of people told me that when I was in Brussels, that don't take this the wrong way. We're going to negotiate. We're going to be tough in our negotiations, but we have to send a signal that it's easier to be in the EU than outside the EU. Continuing on that, it's very interesting that we've talked about trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland when Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. How does that gone down in Northern Ireland? I mean, is Northern Ireland starting to feel different? Is there a sort of resentment there? I'm sure nationalists would like it because clearly they want reunification with Ireland. And what do you think this does to the UK constitution?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that nationalists like it, but they're prepared to live with it because it's something that demonstrates that in their eyes, Northern Ireland is moving toward the Republic of Ireland. And there are certainly constitutional consequences because apart from anything else, decision-making on behalf of Northern Ireland is now taking place at Brussels that we don't have any kind of oversight over at all. I mean, the oversight that any EU member state has over Brussels decision-making perhaps isn't so great, and we send MEPs, and obviously you know all about that, but we send MEPs to Brussels, but they're not given a great deal of power. But Northern Ireland will not have any route into that decision making. And in fact, if businesses want to lobby, they will have to turn to Brussels directly, or they will have to go via Dublin as a conduit. So that's a very significant change. And I mean, that's why, for instance, unionists are challenging this arrangement through the courts, because they see it as an abrogation of the principle of consent, which underwrites the Belfast Agreement.
So look, I want to turn both of you to the Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, where it can be suspended. And we saw that the EU decided to invoke it in a sort of peak of retaliation to Oxford AstraZeneca failing to fulfill, in its view, the order of doses at the time. Now, triggering Article 16 would have placed export controls on the movement of vaccines to Northern Ireland, as the EU wants to protect its supplies. Victoria, why is the EU now threatening the UK when the UK is talking about grace periods?
Yes, so Article 16 is a sort of safeguard clause in the protocol that allows either party to suspend parts of it if it's causing serious economic or societal difficulties. And there is a process associated with it, which ironically enough, the EU didn't bother with the process. They just pulled the trigger when they had their slight vaccine fiasco. And the interesting thing about that was that the whole reason for this protocol was because the EU and Ireland couldn't countenance the possibility of border checks on the land border. And then, of course, when they wanted to stop vaccines coming from the Republic to the north, well, how are they going to do that unless they put border checks on the border to try and hunt down rogue consignments of vaccine, which is, it was all rather farcical, to be fair. Now, the UK hasn't gone the route of Article 16 so far. I guess that is seen as being a bit of a nuclear option. And what the UK representatives on the joint committee that decides these things has decided to do unilaterally is to extend these grace periods. So we're saying, look, we're still trying to implement this, but at the moment we just are not up and running to do it, and it would cause too much hardship. We can't expect businesses and consumers to deal with this right now, so we're extending certain things for a few more months. The EU is not happy about this because they feel like this should have been a negotiated, agreed settlement. And so they are pursuing, or potentially pursuing, the legal remedies, which could be either under the protocol itself, whereby the Commission has powers, and ultimately the European Court of Justice would
let me ask you there, because it seems that the EU is now saying they've got grounds to refer this to the ECJ. Is that right? And should we be worried? I mean, sometimes we've seen cases in the past, a number of member states of the EU simply ignore ECJ rulings. You know, France and Germany have both ignored ECJ rulings in the past. Should we be worried?
Well, I think we should be worried. And I think, you know, as much as anything, I find this extremely annoying because we have had the past couple of years of the Conservative Party, especially the new Johnson administration, talking about, oh, we got Brexit done, we ended the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in this country. Well, you know, no, we didn't. It still prevails in Northern Ireland, and they will have the ultimate say-so if this does proceed that far. The other alternative that they could take is to go through arbitration proceedings under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which wouldn't involve the ECJ. So I would imagine they would probably take the protocol route, which is much set up in a much more friendly way to favour the EU enforcement of it. And so we'll see where that goes. But I find the PR on this quite interesting, because there's a lot of talk about how, you know, the Biden administration is taking great interest in this, and I believe Irish and EU representatives are in Washington right now lobbying for this to get the UK to enforce the protocol rigorously. From a PR perspective, how are we letting this happen? What they are lobbying for is to have essentially make it really, really hard to supply food to the supermarkets of Northern Ireland. That should not be a PR coup for the EU.
Owen, how is this seen in the EU? And I know, sorry, in Northern Ireland, I know Victoria has spoken about food getting to Northern Ireland, but I know there are other issues that people are concerned. I think you were discussing earlier about there's some concerns about vaccines and medicines as well. So how is this being seen in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I don't suppose it's unusual for the EU to go to law, is it? I mean, the EU takes its own member states to the ECJ. It's quick to turn to the law and the enforcement of trade agreements and everything else. So, I mean, this will be a long, drawn out process. We're not going to get an answer to this next week. So, in a way, if this is going to be their route to solving the issue, then the grace periods are not an immediate threat. But the grace periods, it should be remembered as well, only apply to supermarkets. So it's very much a matter just of getting food flowing into Northern Ireland and out to consumers. It's not actually going to help the great majority of Northern Ireland businesses. I mean, Northern Ireland businesses, over 99% of Northern Ireland businesses are actually SMEs. So they are not going to feel the benefits of this, but they are going to feel the constraints of the protocol. And the medicine example which you brought up, I mean, it's a great example of the kind of practical problems that this causes, not only for businesses in Northern Ireland, but also for people, because it was actually Jim Allister asked the health minister in Northern Ireland a question about the distribution of medicines in Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland at the start of 2022 will be in the EU single market for medicines, essentially, and not in the British market for medicines. So there's a major question there about the distribution, say, of vaccines. If a vaccine is approved in the United Kingdom, will Northern Ireland be able to avail of it? I mean, that's a terrifying prospect for people at the moment, because they look at the different the ways that vaccines have been handled in the EU in comparison to Northern Ireland. I mean, it's not a very favourable comparison. So this is going to have real impact on people, particularly as the grace periods run out, and particularly also when shops and businesses get back to trading normally after lockdown.
Victoria, what's been said here, and as I listen to both of you, it seems that Northern Ireland Protocol in effect allows borderless trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic in theory, but puts a border down the sea, the Irish Sea, between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Now, this is undoubtedly, going to perhaps damage the internal market of the UK. Victoria, what does this demonstrate about trade more generally? Is the Northern Ireland Protocol proof that trade barriers are harmful for wealth creation and prosperity? And also, where do you think this is all going to end?
Yeah, I think to your first point, it is fascinating, isn't it, that this is a great illustration of the impact of the non-tariff barriers and customs formalities and the costs of that, because we are seeing just how difficult it is for a third country, even a third country that has functionally, substantively identical rules, to go through the EU's formalities and requirements in order to get especially food, but this is going to come up more and more as I mentioned with medicines as we go forward. So it is an illustration really of how protectionist EU rules can be in how they operate, and it's also an outworking as well of how the EU positioned all of this, using Northern Ireland as a pawn really to try and keep the whole UK very closely in its orbit for regulations. I think Lord Trimble called it a Trojan horse strategy, whereby in order to mitigate the border frictions within the UK internal market, the UK would essentially give up the idea of diverging, because every time Great Britain diverges, it will increase the frictions and the burdens of sending goods to Northern Ireland. Now, where do I see it going? I hope that we don't end up accepting the Trojan horse, but I think at the same time, the protocol has been shown to be pretty much unworkable. I know Jacob Rees-Mogg said in an interview this week that, oh, well, the government always intended it to be a light touch sort of low impact sort of solution. Well, they might have intended that, but that's not what the words on the page actually say at all. So I guess perhaps taking a more robust line, especially bearing in mind from a legal perspective, all is not lost because the protocol is expressed to be without prejudice to the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. So we do have some legal grounds for potentially pushing back if it is causing those kinds of constitutional frictions that we alluded to earlier. And I guess now, because we have left the EU, the trade agreement is in place, potentially we do have a little bit more leverage to just say, no, we're not doing that, because that is a really extreme interpretation of the protocol. We both agreed in the protocol that we would use our best endeavours to mitigate the impacts and preserve trade flows. So that's what we're doing, and sort of dare the EU to take action and strictly enforce it on us.
Now, Owen, if I follow the logic of what you were saying earlier, and tell me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to say, yes, okay, the EU can take action, can refer it to the ECJ. We know these cases take an awful long time. It could actually take much longer for this case to come to fruition or come to light of day than the grace periods. Therefore, it might actually be okay. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I just want to make sure that or maybe can you correct me? What's your logic here? Where do you see it going?
Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing that I would say to that is that the grace periods are only a sticking plaster anyway, so they are not actually dealing with the fundamental problems that exist with Northern Ireland Protocol. This is not going to get a lot better without, at the very least, very major surgery. And I'm talking about, sweeping abrogations. We've got to remember that this was sold to people in Northern Ireland on the basis that only goods that were at risk of entering the EU single market, at risk of compromising the EU single market, would be checked and would be relevant to the protocol. Now, that was something that not only the EU, but also the government told us, I have to stress. So we feel that we've been led down the garden path on this a little bit. And, the idea that food coming into my local supermarket here, that it's at risk of going into the EU single market, somebody from Donegal might buy a ready meal and take it across the border. The idea that that is of any threat at all to the EU single market is just simply not credible, and people are quite angry about this. So if I welcome the fact that Lord Frost is taking a slightly more robust approach to this, and he's taking action unilaterally, because it seemed that the EU had no urgency to sort these things out whatsoever. But it's not enough just to keep pushing things back on this. There has to be some changes, and quite radical changes, to make it workable.
This goes back to some of the discussions I had right at the beginning when I was in the European Parliament just after the referendum. And I remember saying to my colleagues from other EU countries, we're not going to put up a border. You put up a border if you want to. Oh, no, no, no. And Barnier would say to me, no, you're leaving. That means you want a border. I said, no, we're leaving and we don't want a border. But look, just to finish up, there's really this idea today of the new feasibility study, if I'm correct, on the bridge or tunnel or some sort of physical connection between Northern Ireland and Scotland. Is that literally a pipe dream? Is that feasible? And would that actually ease things, or just be another place to sort of have more checks? Owen.
I think it has some value as a symbol of the connection between Great Britain and Northern Ireland and our place in the United Kingdom, because Unionists, if they need anything at the moment, it's some reassurance that this is not going to compromise their place in the United Kingdom, because it's had a psychological impact. It would be wrong to say that it hadn't. Whether it's actually, a practical piece of infrastructure, and whether we'll ever see it, that whether it will ever see the light of day. I mean, I have my doubts, and there are many people in Northern Ireland who say that there's sort of basic infrastructure here that we need before we get that connection. But certainly to try and to try and roll out new and better links to mainland Britain, that can only be a good thing. And the fact that it's being looked at is at least some reassurance, I think, to unionists.
So just to sum up, Victoria, I'm going to come to you first, and then to Owen. Victoria, look, you work at the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, classical liberals, free traders. We want as little borders as possible. We want free trade. How would you sum up the Northern Ireland Protocol, and where should it go? And then I'll ask Owen from his perspective as a sort of a journalist in Northern Ireland about, given that we want that, in Northern Ireland, you want flows of trade, you want the unionist community want to feel very much part of the United Kingdom. Where do we go from here? So you first, Victoria.
So for me, the Northern Ireland Protocol is very much a square peg for a round hole. It's imposing a full third country trade border within a domestic territory where the trade patterns just don't fit at all. And what we should be doing is a pro-free trade solution would be for the border to be for the trade border to be where the geographic national border is, on the land border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but for both sides to apply the maximum facilitations and derogations possible to alleviate the burdens, some of which will be done by taking pragmatic approaches to recognizing each other's regulations where they are equivalent and offer equivalent protections. Because as Owen alluded to, this is supposed to be all about protecting the single market. And once you work from that point backwards, you realize you don't really need very much to happen on that land border.
Thank you. And Owen, final word to you.
Yes, well, the fact that it is supposed to be about protecting the single market, that's a moral weapon in the British government's weaponry, because this is not how it's being applied. It's being applied as something that's punitive, that's something that shows how Brexit can't work, or whatever, however the EU would put it. So it's something that as well will be tremendously injurious to Northern Ireland's economy. The border, any economic border, should be at the land border with the Republic of Ireland, because Northern Ireland does 4 times as much business with the rest of the United Kingdom as it does with the Republic of Ireland. And we've gone as well into the constitutional consequences. It's a very grave document constitutionally. I don't think that was really taken into consideration properly at all by the European Union, particularly given that Northern Ireland within all of our lifetimes has had very profound social problems and violence and conflict and all the rest of it. So it has to go, and there has to be either something put in its place, or just a rethink as to how we do this.
And given that you think it has to go a massive rethink, clearly the EU would look to the Irish government as well and ask them their view. Do you expect the Irish government to keep pushing back against a rethink, or they would, or Martin might play the statesman when Varadkar refused to?
Well, Micheál Martin has had a more constructive attitude to dealing with our government than has his predecessor, and there's certainly potential there for the Republic of Ireland to push for an arrangement that would also be to their benefit, because, as I pointed out earlier, they're suffering from many of the same effects that Northern Ireland is suffering from. So although that has been the Irish government's sort of approach so far, the confrontational thing, the paying the good European thing, the idea that none of this is negotiable, none of that is actually in their interest. So I think really at the moment what they have to drop and what the EU has to drop is this idea that they can still use the protocol to force the United Kingdom back into some kind of alignment with EU rules, because if they're waiting for that to happen, I don't think that I think they're going to be waiting for quite a long time.
Well, Owen and Victoria, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for. It's been a fascinating discussion. I hope people watching this or listening enjoyed it too. We are producing a wide range of original content every week. So if you like what you saw or what you heard, please subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel, IEA London. Listen to our podcasts on Podbean and Apple, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, if you know of someone who might consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, please point them to our website, iea.org.uk/donate-now, where you can donate online. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you'll join us again soon.